One way to think about the biogeography of California lichens that occurred to me was that to either follow Muntz and Orndorff in their discussion of plant communities in California. And another way is to build on Ernie Brodo's discussion of floristic elements in lichens of North America, or mostly climatic elements. And I'll mix both approaches for several reasons. First, the distribution of lichens that grow on vascular plants is somewhat indirect, since they're dependent on finding a suitable substrate, the lichens that is. So they're dependent on where the plants are growing. For example, most lichens are sensitive to the pH of their substrate, and so the lichens that prefer to grow on acidic bark will be often found on pine trees, while big leaf maples support a different set of species. So the distribution of lichens is to some degree dependent on plant distribution. Lichens on rocks are dependent on both the climate regime and the rock type. Limestone versus granite, soft rock like sandstone, or hard rock like chert, or hard rock but with granules and cracks such as granite. California has much less limestone and much more granite, so lichens of calcareous substrates are less common here, except of course on concrete, of which we have a great deal. The biogeographical description will be very rough because the true ranges of most lichens are not very well known. Collections are spotty. Many older collections haven't been reviewed for taxonomic changes. And since I'm a lichen photographer, not a scientist, I'm basing my discussion on my own experience and impressions, not on any systematic study. So I'm going to begin, this will be basically a photographic tour of some California lichens. And I'll begin with some weedy species, part of what Brodo calls the temperate element. Lichens found all over the state, as well as a large part of North America, although some of them don't grow in very dry deserts. This title page photo shows some Betheria vulpina on abies up in the Trinity Alps. Here's a close-up of the same species, Betheria vulpina. This is Physiacesia, and I found it kind of interesting. At one point I got curious about how many times we photographed different species for the book Lichens of North America. It turns out this was the #1 winner. We've taken pictures of this lichen more times than anything else all over North America. I don't know why, except that it grows on rock and bark, and that maybe have something to do with it. This is Candelaria concolor, which is found even in cities. It's one of the relatively pollution-tolerant lichens. This is Fisconia enteroxantha, which I photographed more times than any other species in California. Lecanora muralis, which is found all across the Great Basin and widely across California, both in the Coast Range up into the Sierra. Herbaria sulcata, which is very common lichen, very weedy species all across North America, perhaps less common in California, but it crops up here and there. Hypogymnia imshagii, which is, I think, probably the most common species of Hypogymnia in California. It seems to grow in both some of the damper areas and in the drier areas. Lepticidium albiciliatum, which is found almost always growing with moss all across the state. Placa Serena, which is one of the Placa species that grows on bark with a gray thallus with bright orange apothecia. Sora niponica, which also is associated very much with moss, mossy rocks, and mossy soil. Platysmacia glauca is another one of these lichens that's very weedy across North America, perhaps a little less common in California, but it's very widespread. Mostly it's a forest species, really more the northern parts of California and montane Sierra, I think. Xanthoparmelia cumberlandia, which is found on rocks all across the state. There are quite a number of Xanthoparmelia species that are common. Acrosporus socialis, which is found both in the drier deserts in the Mojave and also in Coast Range. It grows in Tilden Park behind Berkeley on very loose sandstone, forming very greenish-looking patches. Peltigera membranacea. Peltigeras in general are not real common in California compared to wetter forests further north, but they occur all over the state in the right habitat. Umbilicaria fea, which is probably the most common species of Umbilicaria in California.
Could you speak into the microphone?
You bet. Sure. How's that? Better? Rhizocarpon geographicum group, there are a number of these bright yellow-green rhizocarpon species. This is in the Sierra and growing next to a stream. I think it's actually a little semi-aquatic up there. Kallima nigrescens growing on bark. Kallima furfuraceum is very similar and also, possibly even more common in the state. And Lichens laboriosa, which is perhaps the most common of the little black or dark gray dots on rock, the endolithic lichens. California lies at the intersection of some major biomes, the Pacific Northwest Forest, the Great Basin, and the southwestern Sonoran and Mojave deserts. And there are a lot of lichen species in California that are characteristic of those regions. But the most purely Californian region of hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters is the Coast Range. It includes what Grotto called the Madrean element, after the Sierra Madre Occidental of Mexico, and the oceanic element. It's the area that Orndorff called valley and foothill woodland, and it includes much of the chaparral and riparian woodland regions and the drier margins of the northern coastal forest. Oops. It changes slowly from north to south, but more abruptly from the foggy coast to the drier ranges further inland, including the Central Valley and the Sierra foothills. This is the Carmel Valley in early spring, after a rain when the lichens really shine in the landscape. And on the oak trees, you commonly find Flavopomilia caparata, Flavopunctilia flaventior, and Punctilia jackeri, and you often find all three species growing together on the same tree. It's also the heartland of Ramelinum menziesii, which especially favors riparian zones, but it can also be found in some drier habitats as well, even in a few spots in the Sierra foothills. This photo taken near Napa shows what I would think of as the classic form of the lichen. Sometimes it can have strands that are so fine that from a distance you might mistake it for a species of usnea, as in this picture in an old oak preserve near San Luis Obispo. And along the foggy coast down in Baja California, it grows on thorn scrub and cacti. I've seen this lichen looking almost thorny itself, very short branches and thick, just east of here on the east side of Mount Hamilton, very high, very dry chaparral habitat. And widespread in both oak woodlands and chaparral, but not in the Mojave Desert as far as I know, is Evernium prunastri. On rock outcroppings in both the Sierra foothills, where this picture was taken, and also in the Coast Range, you can also often find species of Calla Placa, yellow Acarospora, Xanthoparmelia, Candelariella, and crusts such as Licidia, Lecanora, and Aspersilia. This is a close-up of Calla Placa igneon rock from the Coast Range. And it can also be very well seen on what's called tombstone slate east of Merced in the Sierra foothills. If you drive up toward Yosemite, there's a zone in the lower foothills with these very flat rocks of dark slate and covered with this lichen. You can see it even, from the highway. Also, Fisconia americana on bark, which is a very common species in California and the Coast Range. And in the Coast Range chaparral, you have a mix of species. This is from San Luis Obispo County, with a mix of Xanthoria, and Candelariella, and some Evernium prunastri, and a few other things. Drier chaparral is sometimes bare of lichens, but sometimes it has a good mix of lichens on it. This is Manzanita actually deserves a kind of special mention because occasionally you find Manzanita with a lot of lichens on it, often Latheria vulpina. This picture is Carmfeltia morillii. Often you have species of Candelariella. And the lichens usually grow more on the dead parts of the Manzanita branches rather than the very smooth purple bark, which is, I think, too slick to even get a grip on. Then in the parts of the Coast Range that are more subject to the oceanic element, that are a little bit wetter, some lichens are widespread and others are found more to the north or south. Some that are widespread up and down the state are Ramelina farinacea, which is, other than Ramelinum menziesii, perhaps the most common species of the genus in California. Lecanora pacifica. Xanthoria parietina, which has an interesting distribution in that it's bicoastal. We photographed it on the coast of Maine and also on the coast of California. This is buckeye tree in Berkeley in a park, and it especially favors buckeye trees. I'm going to move ahead pretty quickly now since I'm running out of time. Cladonia messalenta, Armitrima prolatum, Usnea intermedia, which is mostly central state, not extreme north or south, Leptogium palmatum, Cladonia chlorophaea, and Teleschistes flavicans. The fertile form that used to be called Teleschistes exilus is more central and southern. Then in the northern coniferous forest, you have species like Spherophorus tuckermanii and venerabilis, Nephroma helveticum and other species of Nephroma, Ochrolechia oregonensis and other species, especially Ochrolechia subpalescens, Peltigera collina, Cladonia conacrea, Bryaria capillaris, Peltigera britannica, which is a kind of classic, very wet Pacific Northwest forest species, Hormelia hygrophila, and Usnea longissima, growing with Loberia pulmonaria on the same branch, and Loberia oregana, which gets into California a little bit. Shady redwood forests are poorer in lichen diversity, even more open Doug fir and pine forests, although you can sometimes see, oh, pardon me, I didn't mention Alectoria sarmentosa, which is also a classic Pacific Northwest species that gets into California in the far northwest. Redwood forests, fewer lichens, but occasionally you see Liparia pacifica, covering the lower trunks and species of Cladonia, and especially on big leaf maples with a more basic bark, you have Pseudocephalaria anthraspis and Pseudocephalaria anomala growing together, and Loberia pulmonaria. And at higher elevations in the northwest mountains, it's Pseudoephebe pubescens. Then growing in the oceanic central and southern coast ranges are Heterodermia leucomella, Dimolina radiata, Parmatrema stupium, Xanthoparmelia nova mexicana, and Acarospora schleicheri on soil. And then the foggy coast from Marin County down into Baja, what Rodo terms the maritime element, has its own special flora. This is Niebla cephalota, which grows on shrubs all the way up into Oregon, Usnea rubicunda, Philoma mammosum, Xanthoria candelariella, and rather similar looking Calaplaca coraloides. And then up in the northern dunes, you have Carnfeltia californica and Cladonia portentosa subspecies pacifica. The coastal strip in Marin County into Baja, the true fog desert, is notable for the species of Niebla, such as Combioides, Niebla homalia, Perdiceria flavicunda, Schizopeltia californica and Schizopeltia pericii, Lecania brunonis, Dendrographa leucophea, Buellia halonia, Lechinographa hypothalina, and Lechinora pinguis. And then going east into the Mojave Desert, you have Aspersilia cuprea, Xantho mendoza montana on desert shrubs, and a number of things on soil, Peltula richardsii and Sora decipiens. And in the Alpine Sierra, you have Candelariella rossulans, which is pretty weedy across the state, actually. Lechinora sierrae, Lotharia columbiana in the montane zone. This is on Upper Yosemite Creek, and Umbilicaria virginis, as well as other species of Umbilicaria. Sierra cliffs are often streaked with dark gray, with parathecial lichens such as Vericaria and Staurophili, but probably most commonly Basidia atriprunia, which I think is probably the most common lichen in the Sierra. And on the Great Basin, east of the Sierra, you have Rhizoplaca chrysoluca, Xanthoria elegans. The northern Sierra forest, you commonly see Melanohalia elegantula, Vulpicida canadensis, especially in the drier ponderosa pine forests, Tachymonopsis platyphila, Actiona polygula, although this one's not so common, a lot of Bryoria fremontii. And lastly, it's interesting to consider a couple of notable disjuncts, such as Thanolia vermicularis, which was found on a hilltop in Sonoma County, even though it's an Arctic alpine species, was probably brought there on the feet of some bird. and Solarina spongiosa, which Carrie Knudsen recently found down in the mountains of Southern California. It's probably a relic species from the Pleistocene. And I'm going to stop right there. Thank you very much.